Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1107 is one of the best chapters of the arc yet, and in this breakdown, I'll be talking about everything from what the Blackbeard pirate's true goal is, to Sanji's physics-defying abilities, to why Caribou is so important to the story at large, and much, much more. But really quick, around 90% of the people who watch my channel are still not subscribed. So, if you've enjoyed any of my videos, such as the in-depth live-action breakdowns, the weekly manga breakdowns, or more recently, my breakdowns of the anime adaptation of Monsters, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps to support me and grow the channel, and you'll also be able to get my videos as soon as they come out. Now, with all that said, let's get into chapter 1107, I've Been Looking for You. We continue where the last chapter left off, with the entire giant pirate crew disembarking off their ship, which looks to be the Great Eric, one of the ships we had first seen the crew used back during their flashback in the Little Garden arc. This image reminded me a lot of when we first saw the numbers back on Wano, with Goki and Jockey even having the same pose as Dory and Brogy in the spread. This is such a good first page, as it really shows the scale of these giants with their ships in the background, pushing away the Marines in its wake. The Marines on them look like ants relative to the pirates who tower over the trees. Now, the captains of the crew order Oimo and Kashi to take the crew around the island and destroy any marine ships they come across. It's also really cool to see a pirate crew who has absolutely zero hesitation when it comes to attacking marines, let alone a fleet 10 times the size of a buster call. Usually, pirates don't actively seek out fights against the marines, but this crew knows they'll just trample over any enemies that'll come their way. Every time the giant pirates have been brought up in the story, there's always this narrative about how they terrorized the world 100 years ago, and as such, most living marines have likely never experienced this kind of raw power from a single crew in their lives before. The revival of the giant pirates is a world-shaking event that alone could take the credit for being the shock the world never saw coming with the outcome of the Egghead incident. Now, there's a brief recap of the giant pirates in this chapter, but I did a deep dive into the history of the giant pirate crew in my previous chapter breakdown, so I definitely recommend checking that out if you're curious. The rest of the crew seems to have fairly generic Viking-inspired designs. I looked back through to see if we've seen any of these members before in the crew's prior appearances during the Little Garden arc or the Whole Cake Island arc with the flashback, and none seem to be a good match. But something of note, one of the giants has a tattoo resembling a sun, adding to the extensive list of various cultures in the series having some form of sun-inspired imagery. Back over on the Labo phase, Usopp, Nami, and Chopper and Edison are looking down on the giant's arrival. Usopp is in disbelief upon seeing Dory and Brogy, whom he refers to as his masters out of his admiration for them and their warrior spirit that they imparted on him back on Little Garden. Edison reasons that the situation on Egghead has gotten so dire that it's been reported in the news, as we learned it was from the narrator during the day prior, and this seems to be the case given last week's chapter with the giant pirates citing the paper as well. Now, Usopp is moved by the giants coming here just to help them escape the island, much like they promised they would back on Little Garden, when the Straw Hats were trying to leave as well. Brook and Lilith are still trying to figure out how to stop the ship from flying into the Frontier Dome, while Jinbei looks to still be heading out for Zoro. I really like Jinbei's dynamic on the crew here, where he's the one who tries to keep people on task. We've seen him do this throughout the second half of the story, from his plan to make Luffy the hero of Fishman Island, to him organizing a meeting with Beige on Whole Cake, and even more recently, with him trying his best to get Luffy up to the rooftop back on Wano. Zoro seems to be taking his time against Lucci, and of note, while Zoro was using his King of Hell 3-sword style technique earlier in this battle, with the green flames of aura around the blades, it seems like he's reverted to using his regular techniques at this point, though this could just be an unintentional mistake. Now, I'm not really a fan of power scaling, it's not really narratively interesting to me, especially in a series like One Piece, but I don't think it should be really a surprise that Lucci in his awakened Zoan form is this capable against Zoro. Lucci continues to taunt Zoro and the Straw Hats by saying he'll be a burden to the crew. This harkens back to the Little Garden arc, with Zoro suggesting he could choose to cut his own legs off in order to free himself and fight back, while Nami and Vivi were opposed to the idea. Luffy also exhibited the understanding of this mentality during the Whole Cake Island arc when he was willing to rip his own arms off in order to escape, while Nami was once again terrified of the plan. Despite this, it sounds like Zoro is ready to finish this fight, and feels like the next time we see the two will be the real climax where Zoro comes out on top. Moving over to the coast of the island, we get the continued destruction of marine ships from the Pacifista, who have turned coat thanks to Bonnie's authority. It's reported that about 30 ships have been destroyed so far, leaving roughly 70 ships remaining in the marine fleet. As such, a Vice Admiral orders the small ships to retreat and to instead engage with the 20 battleships they have. Recall that 10 battleships are the standard for a buster call, and as such, each one has the destructive power to seemingly take down or at least knock back a Pacifista. The one issuing this order is the Vice Admiral, whom I have been referring to as Chinbeard for weeks, but in this chapter, we finally get his name, Red King. Now his name and design looks to be a reference to the kaiju from the Ultraman series with the same name, and you can see the similarities between their long ribbed necks. We saw him previously use what looked like a mechanical steam-powered arm in order to take down a sea beast, and on that arm was the word red in English, alluding to this name. Now aside from Doberman and Dahl, of the 7 other Vice Admirals who are part of the Marine Fleet at Egghead, this is the second whose name we have learned, and there's an interesting pattern that may be developing. Back in 1094, we learned of Bluegrass, who is seemingly named after the musical genre. Now we have Red King, a nod to the Ultraman kaiju, and I'm curious to see if these are their actual names, or perhaps code names, much like the ones used by the Admirals. While the colors red and blue are already accounted for with the former Admirals Akainu and Aokiji, their codenames use the kanji for the colors, while Bluegrass and Red King are written out with katakana to relay the English words. If these are codenames, I'm wondering if there's some potential for these characters to have been Admiral candidates at some point, perhaps even to replace Kuzan and Sakazuki's vacant spots during the time skip. We've seen a few Admiral candidates in the past who also had codenames with Chaton and Momo Usagi, who both started out as joke characters in the SBS and eventually ended up in the manga proper. These two of course keep with the naming convention of using kanji for the color and the zodiac animal, but there's also Tensei, who has not been confirmed to be an Admiral candidate, but does have a codename who fits into this convention, with Kuro Uma meaning black horse. It's possible Bluegrass and Red King were intended to be candidates who subverted the naming convention. Perhaps the joke is that they are failed Admiral candidates, and as such they have codenames that don't fit the pattern at all. Either way, I find this all very interesting and hope to learn more about the rest of the Vice Admirals here. Back over on the Fabio phase, we continue the scene from the last chapter with Bonnie realizing Luffy is Nika. Now it's always good to see Luffy's easygoing, carefree demeanor in his Gear 5th form, with him bouncing or almost floating mid-air, and I love that Luffy is completely unaware of the significance of Nika or the Sun God, or any of the context surrounding his Devil Fruit. No one has explained it to him just yet, with most of the crew only learning about it just earlier in this arc, and honestly, I kinda hope it stays this way. I don't know that Luffy would even care if he was told about it, but I do bet that he gets some more context about it once we get to Elbaf. While he hasn't made the connection about his powers, he does start putting things together with the situation at hand and realizes Vegapunk's life is in danger. With this, he goes to show Bonnie how to throw a real punch and winds up his arm before Saturn uses his abilities on Luffy. Now, we've seen him do this earlier against Bonnie and Sanji, knocking them back from their head and causing them to cough up blood. It may be the case that this is a weaker version of his abilities to seemingly make people's heads explode, or perhaps this is all he can do against stronger-willed enemies. Either way, it doesn't stop Luffy, who gets hit by it briefly, but manages to strike through with a Gear 5th variation of his Gum Gum Gatling technique with the Gum Gum Dawn Gatling. This resembles some combination of his Elephant Gatling with Gear 3rd and Kong Gatling with Gear 4th, as he no longer needs to inflate his bones with air as he did with Gear 3rd, or his muscles as he did with Gear 4th, but instead is able to simply expand his muscles and physique to be larger. And so his arms are bigger than they were in Gear 4th, but not as ridiculously big as they were in Gear 3rd, due to them being ballooned with air. And I know there have been some critiques of Oda's art over the past few weeks, with it sometimes being hard to interpret or a bit too messy at times, but I have to say, this chapter has had some phenomenal panels, and the one of Saturn getting hit is no different. The attack knocks Saturn back, flying him into a building, much like Luffy did against Kizaru before, and it even draws blood, but we know that it won't stay for too long as he can just restore himself. Now, I've been wondering for a while if Gear 5th is the perfect answer to Saturn's regenerative abilities, as Gear 5th can deal damage to people without physically wounding their external bodies, such as when Luffy punched Kaido and Kizaru's heads in. Now, the rubber powers would allow the external body to become malleable enough to deliver the damage without actually physically impacting the body itself, if that makes sense. So with that, I'm excited to see Luffy try a technique like the Star Gun on Saturn, which may end up being the perfect answer. And there's a bit of linguistic fun there as well, since Saturn is part of the 5 Elders, or Goro Sei, where Sei can be read as Star. Meanwhile, Atlas, Kuma, and Frankie are trying to make their escape with Bonnie. Atlas remarks that their Dom shoes can still be used to hover, which makes me wonder why they couldn't just use them before when they were falling out of the sky in the last chapter, but never mind that. Vegapunk seems to be at death's door here and is unable to go with them. I'm a little surprised we haven't seen Frankie reacting more to this given his affinity for the scientist, but there's only so much panel space that can be given to the scene, though I do hope we get some more of Frankie later on. Kizaru goes to shoot a laser at Bonnie, and Vegapunk here as well, but is intercepted by Sanji, surprising both Frankie and Kizaru. Now, I don't recall an instance where Kizaru has emoted like this to this extent before. He seems genuinely shocked. Even when Rayleigh pulled a similar move back on Sabaody and intercepted Kizaru's leg, Kizaru didn't blink. And I think the difference here may be that Sanji dispersed a laser with his physical body. We've seen people make physical contact with Kizaru before, or even with extensions of his body, such as his sword made of light, but this was a laser beam, something that may not necessarily be able to be interacted with physically through Haki. Even Sentomaru, who boasts about his formidable defense, couldn't disperse Kizaru's light beams. Not only that, Luffy in his Gear 5th form attempted to counter Kizaru's laser by swallowing it, which resulted in him taking internal damage. The closest instance I can think of someone dispersing Kizaru's laser was during Marineford, where Ivankov used their Death Wink to push Luffy out of the way and cause an explosion with the two techniques colliding. But to date, no one has dispersed a laser with their physical body before, not like this. We actually saw Sanji do this to a lesser extent in the previous chapter, though he was unable to block the rest of the beams of light, but here, it seems that he's more capable. Now, how did Sanji do this? Well, he attributes it to the power of love, and I'll talk more on that in just a bit. This could be some new utilization of haki, but I'm not certain that would work on dispersing a beam of light like this. On the other hand, it could be a latent ability of Germa's science that is now coming to the forefront, one that he didn't have when combating Queen's lasers on Onigashima. There's also some chance that this is some of that light pressure glove technology that we saw on display at the start of the arc. Sanji was helping Jinbei move some of Vegapunk's things to the ship, so it's not impossible for him to have stumbled upon this tech earlier, or perhaps Atlas was able to lend this technology to him in some form off screen, as she is the only one in the scene not shown expressing any reaction to this. But let's double back to the idea of it being attributed to love. Now, this may seem like a cheesy cop-out line from Sanji, but this is not the first time the power of love has been used to explain some inexplicable phenomenon in the world of One Piece. Back during the post-Enies Lobby arc, Garp punches Luffy and deals tangible damage, much to everyone's surprise. There, he explains that this was a fist of love. Now, in hindsight, this would seem like a seed for armament haki, but in Volume 62's SBS, when Oda was asked about it, he explains that it wasn't haki, but rather love. Then, during the Thriller Bark arc, the zombie infused with Sanji's shadow, Inupe, also attributes his strength and ability to disobey orders to the power of love, with verbiage that harkens back to the phrase, "Love is always a hurricane." This was first said by Sanji back during the Arlong Park arc, and we would learn during the Amazon Lily arc that this was a phrase that originates from the East Blue. And just earlier in this very arc, Sanji took S-Shark's attack head on without flinching, attributing it to the power of love. Now, it's not exactly clear what the power of love is supposed to be. It's been written in such a way where at times it could be explained as actually being some sort of haki, and at others, it could be due to Sanji's scientific modifications. Even Kizaru remarks how what Sanji did here defies logic, so I'm really interested to see what actually comes of this. This could very well be how Kuma was able to continue moving and operating despite having his memories and autonomy taken from him. Though with all of that said, you may have noticed Sanji's eyebrows has changed direction once again. We first saw this happen to him when he was fighting against Queen, and his latent scientific modifications were coming in. We saw it again during his fight with S-Shark earlier in this arc, and when asked about this in Volume 105's SBS, Oda explained that it was the result of the power of science manifesting in him, and as such, it would seem what Sanji calls the power of love is actually Germa's scientific modifications taking form. But I'm curious to see where this goes. We leave this scene with a classic image of Sanji lighting a cigarette, with Luffy bouncing beside him. Now, as some have pointed out, this is the first time we've seen a Straw Hat fight alongside Luffy in his Gear 5th form, which, all things considered, is pretty fun, with Sanji having called Luffy a moron after learning about this form earlier in the arc. The framing here reminds me a lot of Sakazuki's encounter with Kuma earlier in this arc, and on the topic of admirals, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but we've seen every one of the original admirals and the new admirals fight in this arc, with of course Kizaru on Egghead, but also Sakazuki and Mary Joie against Kuma, Kuzan against Garp and Sword on Fololed, and with Fujitora and Ryokugyu fighting against the revolutionaries during that flashback. Now, while all of this is going on, we cut over to Saturn, getting up as he pushes the rubble from the collapsed building off of himself. To everyone's surprise, in comes Catarina, Devon, and Van Augur of the Blackbeard pirates. We had known there was a Blackbeard pirate ship approaching the island during the day prior, but its intentions weren't really clear, and neither was its status during the present day, since the island is surrounded by marine ships currently. We had long speculated that the ship held both Devon and Lafitte, since they were the only two that were unaccounted for during the prior day's events on Winter Island against Law and Fololed against Garp and Sword. So unless Devon and Augur arrived independently today, then it would seem that the Blackbeard pirate ship from the day prior headed for Egghead after the events of Winter Island, which leaves some things up in the air, such as where was Devon during that time, and where was Lafitte at all. There's some chance that Lafitte is with the group here and just on the ship, but we'll have to see how it goes. When Devon sees Saturn in his demonic form, she shows some interest in his devil fruit abilities. Now, she mentions some sort of goal they had for coming here and considers it complete after touching him. So what could their mission have been? Well, given that Devon was surprised to see Saturn here and his presence made their jobs a bit easier, it feels like touching Saturn wasn't their original objective. And for those confused on the significance of her touching him, recall that she is the mythical dog fruit model Nine-Tailed Fox, which allows her to transform into other people. This ability seems to be a more capable version of the clone fruit, which was able to mimic the physical appearance of others if the user had touched them. So the implication is that Devon's fruit has the same condition. Now, given the context of everything, it seems possible that the Blackbeard pirates' goal here was to gain the likeness of someone who had authority over the Seraphim. At the start of this arc, we got a flashback to Blackbeard's raid on Amazon Lily, where he first learned of the Seraphim's existence. Afterwards, he took Kobe hostage, who may or may not have had an authority chip with him, since he was shown trying to give commands to the Seraphim. With this, Blackbeard may have been able to realize the existence of the authority hierarchy, and as such, would have sent some of his crew to Egghead in order to take the likeness of someone who had a high enough authority level, like Vegapunk. But with Saturn being here, it made this job even easier. Of note, the Blackbeard pirates are not privy to the fact that Bonnie has supreme authority over the Kuma clones, but the rest of the Seraphim should still be subject to the authority level of the 5 Elders. All in all, this is a pretty big deal, with Blackbeard now having the ability to impersonate one of the 5 Elders, even outside of control of the Pacifista and Seraphim. Being able to put a political leader in a compromising situation in the eye of the public has huge ramifications, as we saw with Baroqueworks' plan on Alabasta with Cobra. Now, Saturn questions why someone like Devon, a notorious pirate who escaped from level 6 of Impel Down, would choose to work under Blackbeard. It seems there's something special about him that has motivated Devon, and something that may be related to his bloodline, as stated by Saturn. There's been a lot of speculation on what exactly is going on with Blackbeard, with his weird body, and this could be a hint towards an explanation of that. Could he be part of some specific race we aren't aware of yet? I'm not too sure about that, but it's also possible his ancestry is just unique. There's long been a conversation about how Blackbeard could be related to Roxy Zebek in some form. After all, he has a ship named after him with the Saber of Zebek, and not only that, Augur states that their ultimate goal involves the world at large, angering Saturn. Now, this is very reminiscent of Rox's goal of becoming the king of the world, and we recently learned of Blackbeard's interest in becoming part of the world government, which would position him even closer to Mary Joie. There's also some possibility that Blackbeard has some relation to the ancient giants. This has long been speculated due to Blackbeard's flag bearing the 3 skulls, much like the ones worn by Oars and Little Oars Jr. Not only that, Oars had created a country of villains, not unlike Blackbeard's dream with his kingdom, where he creates a country of criminals. There's honestly a lot of ways that this could go, and I'm excited to see what develops from this. There's also some people who think Shanks was the one who disclosed this information to the Elders when he met with them back during the Reverie. Now, that's very well possible, but the Elders could have learned this information through their own means at some point as well. Now, the two escape Saturn with the help of Augur's warp fruit, but don't get very far as they only make it to the forested part of the island. Augur explains he hasn't fully mastered his powers just yet, and as we know, many of the Blackbeard pirates only received their devil fruit abilities fairly recently. It's unclear just where they are exactly. I would have to guess elsewhere toward the coast of the island, given the foliage and that they're likely headed for the ship, but the presence of Caribou could potentially indicate that they're somehow on the Labo phase, since that's where we last saw him. Though I feel like it's more likely that they're still on the Fabio phase level of the island, and Caribou was just able to somehow escape the upper level, perhaps even causing or taking advantage of the few times the Frontier Dome went down. Now, we've been waiting a long time to see what Caribou has been up to on Egghead. The last we saw him was when Zoro kicked him off the ship back in 1065, over 40 chapters ago, and we got the reveal that Caribou has been seeking out Blackbeard for a long time. I've been speculating Caribou has been wanting to report back to Blackbeard for a while, as we've seen him hint at back on Fishman Island in Wano, and I was thinking he may have already been working with Blackbeard in some capacity, but as it turns out, Caribou is just a big fan, having been inspired by him and now wants to meet him. The way Caribou gushes over the Blackbeard pirates is very reminiscent of Bartolomeo when he first encountered the Straw Hats. Both the Blackbeard pirates and the Straw Hat pirates having their own fanboys who were inspired to become pirates by their captains is a really fun little parallel for the two crews. Not only that, there's a nice texture here within this chapter itself, with Bonnie being in tears realizing who Nika is, and Caribou meeting the Blackbeard pirates. Now, this reveal is actually quite something in the larger context of the story. Caribou was first introduced back in 598, the very first chapter after the time skip, and not too long later, we learned that he was hoping to join the Straw Hat crew in order to kill them. This may have been all in an effort to prove his worth to Blackbeard, who had been after Luffy's head for a while to further his goals, before ending up with Ace's instead. So this reveal has been in the works for the entirety of the second half of the story, truly incredible when you think about it like that. Now, Caribou having the knowledge of two ancient weapons also has some very significant implications. Should Blackbeard get his hands on that information, he may be interested in using them for his own purposes, or perhaps even be willing to leverage that with the world government in order to further his goal of creating a world government recognized kingdom. Either way, we're really at the point where all of these long-running mysteries are finally getting answered, and it's incredible. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about Caribou's allegiance to the Revolutionary Army after his cover story where he was mistaken for the rebel leader Gabaru. However, it should be noted that there has not been any explicit connection between Gabaru and the Revolutionary Army. Plus, Caribou had wanted to get in good with a certain someone back during the Fishman Island arc, which took place before the cover story at all. All in all, this was perhaps the craziest chapter of the Egghead arc just yet, which feels almost silly to say as nearly every week has been filled with new reveals or new developments that blew us away each time. The art looked fantastic, and there were so many incredibly cool moments on each page. Oda has really outdone himself with this one, and I cannot wait until we see where all of the different plot threads go from here. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this breakdown of the chapter or any of my other breakdowns on the channel, be sure to subscribe. It helps to support me and grow the channel, and you'll be able to get my videos as soon as they come out. With all that said, thanks again for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.